Alrighty, welcome back everyone. I hope everyone has had a great 4th of July weekend. It is a much needed break for me, that's for sure. But we're still making paintings and so hopefully this finds you well after your big weekend with family, and if you're not from the States, that you just had a good weekend. So I had a request come in on my previous video with the Airstream trailer that someone wanted me to paint a cactus. And this will be kind of more of a exercise in creating contrast and shape with our paintings. I think that's a big part of this process, is learning how to kind of create dimension with watercolor, which can be a little tricky, but it's achievable and it's pretty simple once you kind of get the hang of it. So let's begin. We're going to start by defining our shape. I'm using Pentalic pens. I've talked about these quite a bit. They're great. You can find them on Amazon for like $5. Well, maybe more, but they come in like packs of 5 and they have different varying thicknesses. They're really good. And I'm using Arches cold press paper. And we're just going to start by loosely defining our shape. And like I said, feel free to follow along with mine. I'll try to get my hand out of the way. It's hard using my top-down camera because sometimes I will get in the way with my own hand. And we're just going to start defining the shape, keeping it on a third. You can even put it in the middle if you want. My general practice, I come from a photography and video background, but dividing the paper up into thirds. So line here, don't draw them on, but line here, and 2 lines going across that way. You can kind of start to pick up like good compositional practices, and putting points of interest on those thirds can be really beneficial to creating visual symmetry, and an overall more pleasing viewing experience in your paintings. It's kind of a cool phenomenon that you can look up on other videos, but it's a very simple technique. We're going to start defining the arms. This cactus has 2 arms poking out, but I'm going to make a third just to mix it up a little bit. And you can kind of just start to really define the shape. My lines aren't super perfect or anything like that. More sketchy looking lines. We're going to come up and we're going to make another arm coming up here. Make this one a little bit longer. Yeah, that's looking good. I'm actually really liking that. No cactus is perfect, so your lines don't have to be perfectly straight. But you also have to remember that cactuses are kind of cylinder. That's their base shape. So you kind of have to draw in mind of that. And so what I mean by that is, if you were to take, I don't want to draw on a nice piece of art paper. We'll draw on my little tape right here. And we all know what a cylinder looks like. It's like a toilet paper roll, kind of something like that. But the key being to create that kind of shape is your lines have to match. So the top and bottom of this cylinder, there's the opening up here at the very top. Your bottom lines kind of have to mirror that shape down here to kind of give it that perceived circle. And so that's the base shape of like a cactus, and then your shadow will kind of help define that shape as well. But that's the base shape of what a cactus looks like. Obviously doesn't look exactly like that, but that's basically what it is. So that's more of what we're trying to achieve here. But I lied. I said I was going to do three little cactus prongs. Maybe we'll do another one coming out here just in the very background. Yeah, something like that. That's looking good. And then cactuses have these big ridges down the middle of them. So we're going to start kind of defining those. And I'm not doing perfectly completed lines, because if we were to do that, it would look a little cartoony. So I'm trying to break them up. I'll actually zoom in for this. Trying to break them up a little bit so that the lines aren't cartoony, because completed lines can be more akin to like a children's cartoon. So it's fun to like, especially with pen and wash, break up your lines a little bit so they're not all just like completed lines, if that makes sense. Kind of like that. And still trying to like randomize them. Just loosely defining these little ridges that we're going to paint in. And we can come back later and really define these once we get some paint on the paper as well. So not overdoing it. But those lines are also kind of following the shape of our cactus. So as they're coming down where this curves right here, this kind of belly part of the cactus, I guess you could say, as our lines will loosely start to follow that curve. And same on this other side. So our lines, as we're drawing, I'll draw over here, are kind of doing this. And they'll start to kind of curve. And then that middle one will be more straight. So that's also helping our process to kind of give it more of a shape with this cactus. So putting that into practice instead of just words, our lines are kind of following that shape up. There's another one possibly here, and it starts to curve at that bottom. And they're kind of all meeting down here. And then this middle one will be a little bit more straight than those other ones. And so that's how you can kind of start to help the shape of your base drawing. It's all about just perceptions and creating the illusion that something is there when you're, in reality, it's not. You're just taking a blank piece of paper and making it look like a representation of something. Same with these. Our lines are going to be a different shape from these lines. These are kind of going more straight up with that little curve into them. If we were to do that, so say this is our cactus arm right here. I'll draw one over here really quick. So say instead of following the curve with our lines like we did right here, if we went straight up and down with them, look how off that looks. It doesn't work. Whereas opposed to what we're doing here with this arm, is our lines are now varied and they're kind of following that curve. This one looks way more natural than this one. So you have to be intentional with your line work, especially on shapes like this. And I know I talk a lot about making your line work look unintentional. It's a fine balance of being specific enough with your line work to give accurate representation while still maintaining that artistic integrity and making it look artsy. It's I'm getting very philosophical and theory based, I guess, but it's all in practice and just trying to just practice these things and doing it more intentional, especially as you're starting out, and then it kind of becomes second nature. Same with this arm. These lines will be different from the other one. So these lines kind of face us, so they're going to curve up like that. This will kind of follow that arm. And even with this back arm, we'll kind of follow it up like that. That's maybe good. Maybe add another one back there. Cool. And then we'll zoom back out. And if this is at all confusing, please let me know in the comments. I know it's kind of hard to put into words, especially when I'm not working off of a script. So maybe I would benefit from scripting these, but I just don't have the time to want to script full paintings, and I kind of like just talking as I paint, and just sharing little bits of what I feel would be helpful. So let me know if that's helping you guys. Yeah, stuff like that. That's looking really good. We're going to have tufts of grass down here, and with these I'm going to very, very loosely just put in little shapes, kind of more jaggedy lines. Something like that. And these will be much more rough and representational of grass rather than defining the shape like we did with that, just because I don't want to spend a whole lot of time. And these aren't the focal point of our drawing, so it's not super crucial that we define these as much, and the color will kind of help that. We can add some twigs in down here, some like dried up shrubs, maybe some more tufts of grass over here. We could even do something like that. Maybe let's do another little Moab kind of mountain range in the background. And with these, I'm kind of picturing our horizon line being something like right back here. I'm not going to draw it on my paper, but it's going to kind of cut through. And so our mountains that are in the background, the further away they are, the smaller they're going to appear clear back there, but they're still going to be large enough that they're kind of looking like a mountain range, you know. But the further back they are, you can kind of make them smaller, and that gives depth to your painting. Kind of helps things look further away, whereas this will be the largest thing because we're closest to this cactus. But if we were to put these mountains clear up to the top of our paper, that'd make them look much closer in the frame, versus if we put them way far away and lower in the frame, that'll kind of help them look like they're way off in the distance, which is kind of what we're trying to achieve here. And some more shrubs back here. Yeah, that's looking pretty good. Cool. Alrighty, now we're going to move into the wash portion of this painting. I'm going to clean off my palette because it is looking nasty. Just taking some water and taking it over all of those dried paints and reactivating them. And then just taking a piece of paper towel and wiping them off, and that clears off your palette. Super easy. I'm going to be using one brush, which is just a Master's Touch brush. Use this one. You can do most of these paintings with just one brush, which is really nice. So definitely when you're starting out, don't feel like you need to spend hundreds of dollars on brushes. I would rather you buy better paper and better paints. Like Winsor Newton. This is a Winsor Newton palette. This is really good. Arches watercolor cold press paper is really good. And we're just going to start pulling in some green. And that's a pretty light green. So maybe what we'll do is take some white and mix it in. White kind of dulls your painting, so you have to be careful. White will not lighten your color, it'll just dull it down a little bit, so it makes it a little bit more milky. So don't add white in trying to make your paints lighter, because it will not do that. It'll just make them a bit duller, and it might lighten up the color a tiny bit, but just kind of milky. It makes it a little bit more milky. And I'm just taking my brush and using the very, very edge of it, kind of like the knife edge of the blade, and starting to come down. And we're just going to start filling in this whole cactus. And we can leave some white spots for sure. I don't like my paintings being too neat. That's just the way I work. But what we're trying to picture is you have to think of where your light source is coming from, especially when you're trying to create three-dimensional objects. So I'm going to picture my light source coming from right here. So imagine the sun's kind of up here. It's going to hit this cactus and light up this face and shade this side. So you have to kind of think the light is wrapping around this cylinder shape, and we'll shade one side and make one side lighter. So paint with that in mind, and kind of think through how you want your lighting to be portrayed. So that means there's going to be a darker shadow on this side and on this side. And then there's going to be shadows underneath where these arms are as well. And I'll go over that once we actually go in and work on that. But we can always come back and add more color. So do not go overboard and make it as dark as possible, because especially with watercolor, you want to work from light to dark for sure. And I'm using a, excuse me, geez. I'm using a brush that's relatively dry, meaning there's not tons of water on it, with more color than there is water. And that's giving me more texture. A drier brush will it'll pick up the tooth of the paper more. And a drier brush will pick up and put more texture on the tooth of the paper more than a wet brush will. A wet brush will kind of fill in all of the little gaps, whereas a drier brush I should say, will leaves a little bit of texture. And so I'm leaving some white spots, stuff like that. And then we can come through and add more water to our brush if we want lighter color, especially where the sun is going to hit these lighter portions of this cactus. So once again, going over that, using a green, mixing it with a little bit of white, and that gives me that nice cactus color right there. And we're going to let this dry for a second, and we'll come back over with some darker paint. But for now, we're going to work on the foreground. So the foreground has a lot of tans in it. So we're going to bring more of a tan color. And we can once again bring in a little bit more white. Kind of dull that color down. Sometimes too saturated of colors can look a little off in your paintings and look a little more cartoony. Earthy colors are usually more natural, a little bit less saturated than you'd imagine. So it's kind of a balance, but you can do whatever you want. There's no set guidelines for this, but we're going to start coming through and just defining this grass. And this one I'm using a little bit of a wetter brush. Coming through and trying to keep my brush strokes going the same way. Especially if you're using a drier brush for more texture. If you're using a wetter brush and you're just trying to fill in large spaces, you can use whatever technique you want as far as like the way that your brush strokes lay. But if you're trying to add in detail and be more specific with your brush strokes, you want it to be trying to go the same way. Oftentimes I'll work in a left to right pattern, kind of like that, using the edge of my brush and keeping it going left to right. And that can help define your ground as well. But if you're gonna add in little like grass tufts and stuff like that and start to define those, you can use an upward motion as well with a pretty dry brush and starting to kind of like fill that stuff in. Yeah, and we can come back through and define a lot more once this is dry. We don't want to overdo it for now. And we'll start to pull it into that background using a lot wetter brush because your colors will actually get less saturated the further back they go. So you want less paint on your brush and more water. And that'll help give it that kind of depth. And if you go outside and were to look at the mountains in the background or any scenery that's far off in the distance, it looks more hazy. And so we're trying to achieve that. And the way we achieve that is just using way less color on our brush. Especially the further back these mountains go. Yeah, it's looking good. So our foreground will have way more saturation. Background will have way less saturation. Now we're going to come through, dry off our brush, rinse it off, and we're going to pull in some blue. Let's clean off a little bit of our palette for our sky. So we're not mixing colors. If you were to put yellow in your sky with blue, you'd have a green sky. That would be horrible. So we're going to clean that off as best we can. And we're going to come back through, make sure our brush is clean. Try not to mix colors that we don't want mixed. And we're going to take some blue, put it in that clean spot that we were working on. Something like that. And this blue is just a little too dark for my liking for the sky. So what we're going to do is clean off our white because we have a lot of brown on there. We're going to come through and just dab it off after we wet the blue. And that'll clean off and kind of reset our color. That's why I love watercolor. It's very easy to clean and maintain. It's not super messy. And you can always reactivate your old paints, no matter how dry and crusted they may look. And we're going to add quite a bit of white into our blue, and that's going to give us a nice kind of baby blue for our sky. So going upward on our paper, if we're to start our sky up here, this portion will be darker than the portion down near the horizon. It'll get more hazy and light as we go down and darker as we go up. And I believe this is called a graduation in our color. I actually made my blue a little too milky, so I'm going to take some more blue back in, and that'll kind of reverse that. And just pulling down using a fairly wet brush. For skies, a wetter brush can look nice. You don't want your sky to be too textured. And if I need to pull that color down, all I do is just add more water to my brush. Don't add more paint, and more water will actually start to pull it down for you. You don't want to create puddles of water on your paper, but using a little bit of water can help pull the existing color that's on your brush and on the paper downward. And I'm going a left to right motion again, keeping my lines as structured as possible for this, especially. And we're not going to put any clouds in, so we're not going to leave any white spaces for now. Yep, that's looking good. Still having a fairly wet brush. Once again, trying not to pool the water on my paper. Cheaper papers will definitely pool a little easier. They won't absorb. They'll kind of just push the paint and water around, which can be very frustrating. So that's why I recommend you getting a higher quality paper. And we're going to come back up and actually add more blue into the top. Something like that. And that's going to help our sky to start looking a little bit more dimensional. Right now it's a little flat with how light that blue was. Keeping those left to right brush strokes with a fairly wet brush, trying not to pool the water. I'm going to say that over and over again. But if you let your water pool on your paper, you're going to have a lot of problems. And I'm okay even if my little bit of blue gets into that cactus green. We're not going for perfection here. But that's looking pretty good. And we can always come back later when it's dry and add more. So try not to overdo it for now. And now that we're working on this, let's come back and add just a little hint of green into our foreground, because deserts have very varied colors. And so they're not all going to be just one color. There's kind of a lot of browns, greens, tans, stuff like that. So we'll come back through and always touch your paper, see if it's fairly dry, because we don't want a lot of bleeding. The wetter your paper is, and if you paint over wet spots, the paint will kind of tend to go into those areas naturally. And I'm using a fairly dry brush with bristles that are kind of separated from each other. You can see they're spreading out just a little bit. Put it on right there. You can see that they are fairly dry with a lot more color, and they'll give a lot of texture if you have a drier bristle going upwards. See how that kind of starts to add little tufts of grass in? So minimize your water on your paintbrush and use more color, and that'll kind of give you more texture into this area. And we can do little dabbles back here. Not all over the place. You want to be a little bit more controlled with these. You don't want them all over, because then it will just kind of create confusion in your piece. And I'm having all of these tufts of grass going the same way. And then as they get further back, they get smaller and lighter. And so I'm not going the full amount that I go on my foreground. They're going to just get smaller. And I'm just using just the very tip of my brush and just kind of adding in just little dabs here and there. I'm not using full brush strokes. I'm just kind of adding in just little titches of texture in the background. And we can even do that with, if we wanted to do some dirt, we can take some brown. Let's mix some tan in there. And we can do that same thing with a fairly dry brush and just add in some little dabbles of texture, which can give us some dirt. Trying to vary them a little bit too. You don't want them all to look the same. But that's just going to help our foreground stand out from our background. And I just added a little bit more color to my brush to add in maybe some intentional dirt spots. Still working left to right. And then our immediate foreground that's closest to us, this area right here, is going to have the most texture and detail and contrast. So you can kind of really work in quite a bit of work here. So we're going to actually add in some long brush strokes right here. And we'll come back through and define all this with our pen. But using a fairly dry brush and just pulling off to those sides, these will be little plants that are in the foreground that will come through and define. And that'll give some separation. So these foreground elements, oh, you can't even see that, sorry. Oop. I will zoom out and show you again. So these right here will act as little foreground elements that kind of separate. It gives dimension to your painting. So these will be defined once we come back through with our pen and draw into them. Little plants kind of in the frame, and then that'll give this a nice natural frame, and then our background will be very light. And that's how you create depth in your paintings. And so I feel like I'm in a good place, and feel free to pause this video and take as much time as you need building up. I tend to work pretty quickly, especially just for video length's sake. I don't want to spend hours and hours and hours, but you could if you wanted to. but now we're going to come through and add more contrast to our foreground. So a little bit of green and brown can add some nice foliage. We're really going to start coming through and picking those spots with a pretty dry brush again, using the bristles to your advantage to give that texture. And you'll really be able to see what I'm doing now, which is awesome. And just going back over some of those dark brown spots. And we can even switch our brush to like, so instead of going like this the whole way, with this we switch it to like, so instead of using this the whole time, we can switch to this side and add really thin brush strokes in, very, very light, trying to only use one swift motion instead of multiple to create those little grass pieces kind of going all over the place. And just very, very little on those. We're not trying to do it everywhere. And we can always come back through with our pen and redefine some of these. And we're going to leave some empty space for just some nice desert dirt. So not everywhere has to have grass on it. Cool. Now I feel like our cactus is going to be very, very dry. You can always touch it, feel it, make sure it's good. And we're going to use that same green that we just used. Pretty dry brush again. And now this is coming back to that, where do we want our light source coming from? So our light source, remember, is coming from here. So it's going to shade the left side of our cactus. So you want to be intentional with this part, but we're just going to bring, I guess our brush is like medium damp with quite a bit of color on there because you want it to kind of flow together. And we're just going to shade that side. And then we also have to remember that this is protruding out in front of this part. So this arm is going to cast a shadow back down this way. So we can kind of come through and pull something down like that. And that helps solidify shapes in your scene, and helps give them a like spatial awareness with each other. It's really interesting, and when you practice this, it'll start to make so much sense. If you start thinking of what direction light sources are coming from, and how are they affecting the shapes in my drawing. Yeah, something like that is looking really good. Yep, and we're just gonna slightly wet our brush and we're gonna pull some of that dark color around to the front. Not all the way though, we're leaving enough to really make it look like sun is hitting that, but we're kind of softening those transitional lines that we just created with that darkness. And that's essentially how you create depth in your drawings. And you can come back through and really add a lot of contrast in if you want to. It's kind of up to you. But brown with green will really help that kind of sit into the space. And you can, like I said, add as much as you want. And you can even come through and add some more to these little tufts of grass that we've added. So it's just working in passes, working in layers, coming back. Try not to do all of your layers all at once. You want to work light to dark. If you work dark to light, it's not going to work out, and you're just going to end up with a frustrating piece that you throw in the trash. So work light to dark and work intentionally and slowly. But when I say intentional, we're not being hyper diligent as far as like getting every line perfect. I'm more intentional with my brush strokes in the direction they're going and my light source. That's what creates that cohesion in your piece, I feel, at least. Now we can come through and define some of that background now that it's drier, I guess. And we got to be careful. We do not want our background to stick out too much. We're going to use a very, very wet brush with just a little color on it. And we're going to come through and just define that. Same thing though, I almost made that mistake, just barely, is we're going to think of where our light source is coming from. So since I just added that in the wrong spot, I'm going to take some water on my brush without any color and try to reverse some of that color. And I added too wet, so you can learn from my mistake I just did. But we got a picture of the light source is hitting right here, so this side will be more shaded. So we definitely want to keep that fairly intentional. And you want these colors to not be super, super, super saturated. You want them to be lighter than your foreground. So it's kind of a balancing act. But that will give you some atmospheric space in your drawing or painting. I always say drawing, man. And we can add some more colors into the background so it's not all just the same tan color. Going left to right, always left to right, or whatever, right to left if you're more comfortable with that. But just the idea being more consistent brush strokes. I am super, super happy with this actually. So now that our foreground, and you can let this dry, you can take a hair dryer if you want and dry it quickly if you want. I'm just gonna go for it though, because I'm kind of wanting to wrap this up. We're gonna start defining our foreground, and we can just come through with another Pentelec pen. This time I'm using a thicker pen. This is the 0.5. Before I was using the 0.3. So using different pen sizes can give you varied lines. So not all of your lines will be thin, some will be thick, and that's good. And we're just gonna lightly define some of these shapes that we've come through and put on our paper with that paint. So it's kind of cool because you can kind of define certain shapes with paint even after the fact, and you can come back through with your pen and make those look more like what you're intending later on after you've already done all that stuff. Yep, and we'll just lightly, we're not trying to make all of our lines perfect and complete. We're just trying to give a little representation to what that little paint spot is supposed to be. So something like, is it grass? Is it going to be a rock? Is it going to be a twig? Whatever. So I feel like I'm kind of just rambling, so sorry if it's not making much sense. I had a very busy weekend with work, so I'm kind of running on not too much sleep this weekend. So if I'm not making a whole lot of sense, I apologize. Same thing though, as our lines get further away from us, they need to get lighter and less intense and less common. We don't want a ton of lines going all the way back because it just will convolute our painting and make things look confusing, and there won't be much depth to it if everything all had the same amount of detail. So we can add some little tufts, clear back here. Working on that left to right though, for sure. And maybe there's some rocks right here. And just working all this stuff in. You can take as long as you want on this. I've done a ton of paintings, so I'm more comfortable moving quick. And that's just kind of how I work, especially with pen and wash. Pen and wash is nice because you can kind of just work at whatever pace you want. If you want to do quick ones and more impressionistic, that's totally fine. If you want to go mega detailed, you could. My style is more loose and whimsical. I don't know if that's the right word for it, but that's kind of what I like. More something you'd see out of like a sketchbook or something. Less perfectionist, less, you can go hyper realistic if you wanted to. If that's your jam, go for it. But for these ones, I also do hyper realistic dog drawings. So this is always a nice break because I can always get these paintings done in like 20 to 30 minutes. And they're just a nice little project. So with this, I'm kind of defining these shadows with more impressionistic pen marks, but I'm also following the shape. So I'm not just adding, so if we come back to these little shapes right here, I'm not just adding flat lines like that. I'm trying to curve them with the shape to give it more of a rounded shape. So if you watch closely right here, I'm kind of following them in, not going all the way across that shape, but that'll help add in just like a more impressionistic shadow. And same right here, you've got to kind of follow the curve of your shape. If you're to go flat, it would look flat. If you're going to go curved, it'll look curved. And as it approaches the top, since we're lower than it, they're going to switch directions. So if that makes any sense. So once again, what I'm doing here, just following Just adding in a very, very light amount of these, not trying to overdo it. And then if we go up to the top, they'll kind of switch midway because now the cactus is getting higher than our angle of view. And so they're going to kind of switch and start going upward. And I'll zoom out a little bit so you guys can see that. And that just helps kind of redefine that shape. Same thing over here. So really practice your lines. And it's kind of an art form in and of itself, making them look unintentionally artsy. And it will come over time. It just takes practice, practice, practice. I got a little messy in there for me, for my liking, but we'll roll with it. So sometimes you can definitely overwork pieces. I am a very, happens to me all the time. I will overwork stuff. So definitely don't go too gung-ho on it and right off the bat just start putting lines down, or too many lines down. You kind of want to step back and say, okay, if I added enough lines, and am I risking overdoing this piece? Because there is a fine line you can easily cross of it looking really nice to it looking very, very messy. Yeah, that's looking really good actually. I really like these foreground grass pieces that we added in. That kind of helps just give a natural frame. I'll zoom out for you. Gives a natural frame to the piece. These ones is what I was talking about. And since it's a desert, let's add birds. We'll put them over on this side. Kind of just varying little V shapes. We always love birds here, don't we? Okay, and let's pull off the tape, my favorite part. So I hope this makes sense as far as shading. Shading your piece and giving depth to your painting. Key takeaways here are think of your light source. What direction is it coming from? And think of your shape. Especially with this cactus is more cylinder, so your light is going to wrap around the piece and be shaded on the side that the sun is not hitting and lighter on the side that the sun is hitting. And then work with your line direction and consistency, and that can help define those shapes. Thank you guys so much for stopping by. I hope you had a great weekend, and I'll see you at the next one.